My general focus is large prints, but regardless of what the size that you're making, the quality of your image is very important. And I blog about this, I write about this, there's some articles, but I wanted to actually make a video and actually look at some of these details in terms of printing. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is I got some various images from my portfolio. And I've got, some portrait projects, and I've got landscape projects, things like that. And I want to speak a little bit, first of all, when you're thinking about print quality. And really, this goes for any image I make. I mean, I'm not talking about snapshots on my cell phone, but if I'm doing a serious image that I want to put on my wall, I want to be thinking, first of all, about image quality from the very start. And so I'll take an image like this, and of course, we're looking at the finished process image here. And if we take an image, and I want to actually go, let's take this image for example, just to give you a bold example. And let's go to the original RAW for this, okay? Now here's the original RAW with Lightroom application, okay? And here is the original RAW, the finished version, after Photoshop. Because remember, anytime I'm doing a print on the wall, it's going to go to Photoshop. I'm not going to end with Lightroom. Lightroom is great. It does most of the heavy lifting, but I can always make an image more refined in Photoshop. And so when I go to print, I'm looking to make that one image. And this is the beauty of the exercise and the result of printing. It kind of forces you, just like competition does, it kind of forces you to analyze, okay, what's my best image and how do I want to present it? Now, for a moment, I want to go back to this RAW file, and I just want to reset this. And I'll just use like a reset preset from Power Workflow, just so I leave the crop and stuff alone, but I reset all the settings. You can see that straight out of camera, and this was done on an A7R II, and that's an amazing sensor on there, and I probably wouldn't have been able to get the dynamic range had it not been on a sensor like this. So you can see that this is really flat, but of course a RAW file, it was intentionally taking really flat. I took as flat of an image as possible. A RAW file is like a negative. It's not meant to be ready to print. There's no such thing as a negative that's out of camera. You have to process it. And the same thing with RAW. There's really no such thing as a RAW that's out of camera. Inherently, by its nature, a digital file must be processed. And so when I shoot for an image, and I'm always thinking in terms of making a good print, right? So of course I'm doing all the stuff we talk about all the time in camera, things that I talk about in Expose, like the zones, and in photographics, like the composition and all that. But I want to go further than that. And I think from the very beginning about making the image as good as it can be in terms of dynamic range, making sure I'm not clipping my highlights, etc. Okay? But this is less of a video today about the post-processing and more about finished results and where I go from there. What I'm getting at with this, though, is that making sure I'm following the 6 keys to image quality, that I'm stable, that I have a good optic, that my post-processing is good. And you can read the 6 keys to image quality on Seim Effects, and you can search for it on there. But the bottom line is, if I have good image quality, good stability, using a tripod, things like that. So let's zoom in on this. And I want to zoom in on this image, and you can see that even though it's a 15-second exposure, I mean, obviously I'm on a tripod. We have tack sharp, really nice, clean image from the RAW file. Because if you don't start good, you're not going to end good. Now, this video today isn't just about this image, though, and I want to go back to my portfolio stuff, just stuff that I've printed, and talk a little bit about what I do once I have the image. So let's assume that you have a good image, right? You've done it right in camera, because it should always start there. But processing for your print is also important. And I want to talk a little bit about resolution today. I want to talk a little bit about processing from the beginning. The first thing is you want to have a RAW file. And my belief is that you should stay with that RAW file as long as possible. Not that you don't export to Photoshop or some other similar pixel level editor. It's that you work the essentials in the RAW file, meaning you go through in that RAW file and you pull out the dynamic range. You deal with your fundamental tone stuff, the stuff that doesn't have to be localized. The global edits is where a program like Lightroom or Capture One or something like that, where it really shines. And so it's your main process. The finish process, Photoshop has really become a finish process tool. It's where we do those final details. Now, of course, you can fully process an image in Photoshop, but I would argue that you're going to do better with a RAW file to start with. And of course, you could use Photoshop Camera Raw and not use Lightroom, or you could use another program that processes the RAW. What I'm getting at is for quality, I process the RAW as impeccably as possible. looking at the detail, thinking about the grain. I don't do a lot of sharpening on that raw file because I'm going to go out to Photoshop. The final details, usually like sharpening and grain if I'm going for print, I will do at the very end on the PSD or the TIFF file out of Photoshop right before I go to print. Okay, so I work with the raw file as long as possible. Then I'm going to take that and I'm going to go into Photoshop. Okay, so I don't do this with every image, understand, because we talk about presets and workflow and things like that. And for the volume of images, for the most of the images, in let's say a portrait session, I'm just going to make them look great in Lightroom. But if they order a print, or if it's a landscape and I'm going to print, absolutely, then I'm going to go take it to the next level and prepare it for print by maximizing my detail, using things like burning and dodging and stuff like that. But again, this isn't really a retouching so much as talking about the print. Once again, we have great detail. Now, the A7R photos are 42 megapixels, but I've got a 46-inch print sitting on the wall over there from an 8 megapixel file. So while I want as much resolution as I can, this is still nowhere near where a good, well-made 4x5 image that was photographed on film and scanned would be, okay? So digital's getting better and better, but if you're making large prints, 36, 40, 50, and really, in my opinion, that's a lot of where it's at, because in a world where photos are everywhere and they're kind of a commodity, pristine, well-made wall portraits are a whole different category. And that's why when you go into resort towns and stuff like that, when you go into Vegas and you go into the galleries of famous landscape photographers and stuff like that, they're not hanging 11x14s on mats on the wall. They're showing their skill and they're maximizing the quality. And that's what I'm always looking to do in an image. So I'm always looking to think about, okay, am I using a good lens that's going to give me good quality? I mean, we can see that we got a clean image edge to edge on this. I believe I just used a 40 millimeter Canon on this one. But my point is, now, yeah, this was a 40 millimeter, just that 40 millimeter pancake, I think, which is a pretty dang sharp lens, okay? But we have detail. We have good execution in camera. Now I'm thinking in what we're talking about today in terms of post-processing. I've processed in Lightroom, and then I'm coming in here, and you can see I'm making layers. Now, if you look up here, you'll see I'm in 16-bit. If you're processing for print, I know it's slower, but I'm going to take it out of Lightroom as a 16-bit file. Okay, so I have my raw file, which might be 12 or 14 or something like that in terms of its bit rate, right? Then I'm going to a 16-bit, so I'm going to make sure I'm not throwing away any of that quality. It's going to be a large file. Yeah, the layers are going to build it up, and it's going to be a huge file size, but disk space is cheap. So I'm going to work with that 16-bit file. I'm going to do layers, and I'm going to be careful. I'm going to try not to overwork it, because we've all seen an image. We've all made an image like this where we wanted to make an image that was great, even though our starting image wasn't great. And we worked it and worked it and worked it. And eventually it just kind of feels worked to death. And I try and avoid that. And that goes back to getting it right in camera. But now I come in and I'm looking at an image. So you can see over here, I'm making layers. And I've got my layers where I do small details. Maybe a little cloning, a little burn and dodge. Okay, so you can see some things I've done in here beyond the Lightroom file. Okay, so I'm on a second generation file. I started with the raw file. I did all my fundamental work there. Now I went to a Photoshop file, in this case a TIFF, a 16-bit layered TIFF, okay? And you can see what I've done here. Let's look at the resolution of this file. It is 7670 by 5304. So I've got a lot of resolution. Let's actually look at that in Photoshop and think how much that is in terms of inches. See, think about this in terms of resolution. This is a very new high-resolution camera. We're still only 31 inches at 240 dpi. Now, when I'm doing for print, we say, well, in the right conditions, the eyes can see around 300 dpi, right? If I'm doing a large print, I don't really want to print below 220 dpi, which means I'm going to have to upconvert to really maximize that quality. But remember, upconversion's not the same as having the resolution in the first place, okay? So let's go back to Lightroom, and we see these different images here. Good quality, processed from the raw, taken into Photoshop, processed from there. Now you have this good file. You haven't introduced a bunch of artifacts. You've got a good, clean file. What are you going to do with it? And this is the key thing here, is now I'm going to go to print. Okay, so now I might do a little sharpening, be it in Lightroom or in Photoshop, and I might do a little bit of grain, whatever it is. Sometimes I'll add just a little bit of grain to kind of keep that film feel at the end, okay? But once again, if I'm sending to a lab, I may have to go out to a JPEG. If I'm printing myself, like I'm usually doing, I'm going to actually print the 16-bit file. So I might export one more 16-bit TIFF or PSD, right? I'm keeping the bit rate, the quality as high as I can, and I want as few file generations. So you see what I'm not doing here is I'm not saying, oh, let's edit a new copy and have that be an 8-bit JPEG, and then I'm going to save it. And then I want to do something else. So I'm going to edit a new copy and have that be another 8-bit JPEG, because we're degrading with each generation. So you see if I go in and edit an image, I have my original RAW. Now here's my edited TIFF, right? My finished version. But if I want to go tweak something, I've saved all the layers. I go back to edit original. I don't make a new copy. I edit my second generation file. And then when I'm ready to print, I take that second generation file, which I may now have applied a few more final details on in Lightroom, and I export that as the highest quality file I can, and I take it to Photoshop for printing. Some people print from Lightroom. I like printing from Photoshop because I use the Canon print plugin. For some of you, it may be exporting a file to send to a lab. And if you're doing that, a lot of times you may have to export an 8-bit JPEG, although some labs might take other things. So the very last thing I'm going to think about is resolution. Now I've done all the work, I'm thinking about resolution. How much can I print with my file? And this is not really an exact science because you can upconvert a file. The upconvert a file in Photoshop, I mean, I could say, hey, make this 40 inches at 240 DPI, or let's say 300, right? So now it's going to make it 12,000 pixels. Now, bear in mind, it's kind of filling in the information, and so it's going to help, but it's not the same as having that resolution. But I will upconvert an image before printing, because if I'm printing at that size, people think, oh, I've got 20 megapixels, that's a ton. 20 megapixels is not a ton if you're printing a 30, 40, 50-inch print, which is what you put on a wall, okay? And so if you do that, there's nothing wrong. If you have a camera that's 12 megapixels or 16, you can still make great images, but it goes back to following this whole process we're talked about today, and then that goes into, okay, prepping the image for print. And in prepping the image for print, I'm going to try and be at least 220 or so DPI, even if I have to upconvert it. If I'm printing a 60-inch, I may not upconvert this to 300 DPI, because I'm really not going to be adding that much at that point, and it's going to be such a huge file, it's absurd. But bear in mind, this is my final output file that I'm going to do this on, not a layered file like this. I'm outputting a final print file for the size I'm printing, okay? So if I'm going to make that 40-inch print, I'm thinking, okay, maybe a little bit of sharpening. I can do it in Lightroom, or I can just go up here. Sometimes I'll upconvert, and then I'll just do a little bit of a smart sharpen. And it's not rocket science so much. I mean, I know we try and make a big deal about this sometimes, but a lot of it is seeing what it looks like. And so what I'll do is I'll turn on the rulers, and rather than just go to 100%, I'll actually set the image size to where the ruler is roughly 1 inch in the real world, okay? So let's say, what's the size of this image? This image is set as a 32-inch image right now, okay? So now I'm looking at the actual detail for a 32-inch image. If I upconvert this, okay, I'm at 240. Now I say, no, I'm going to print a 50-incher, right? So I'm going to upconvert this, which of course is going to increase the size. I'll upconvert the image, and I'll look at the detail based on that size. Now I should have flattened, because again, I would be exporting a final flattened image. I wouldn't be working on my layered master. But again, I'm on the 16-bit. I'm using maximum quality, and even if I have to go out to JPEG, I'm going to do all of these steps up to the end, and then I'll save out as a JPEG, because I want all the steps along the way to be with the highest quality possible file I can get. And this stuff matters when it comes to print time. And so this is upconverting really slow, so I'm actually going to flatten this because I should have done that anyway. And now I'm going to upconvert to 50 inches on the vertical edge, on the long edge, okay? And so I'm going to go into Photoshop. If I'm going really large, sometimes I'll use like On1's upconversion software and third-party plugins and things like that to just get a little bit of an edge, but Photoshop does upconvert really well. So usually I won't do that unless I'm going like 70, 80 inches, let's say. The larger the image I go, the more time I will spend, especially if there's open skies. I'll look around for artifacts, and as you expand an image, as you resize it, as you make it big, as you work on it, especially in areas where a lot of solid colors exist, artifacts appear more. And so I'll look over it in immense detail. Okay, here, we're looking at an equivalent of a 50-inch image on the screen. And I'm going to kind of roll across it. Now, I started with a high-res file. This will print beautifully as a 50. I mean, I could do a 70 or an 80 on this, and even though I'm still upconverting. But we have detail throughout the image. A lot of control and a lot of detail. So at the end of the day, how big can you print from your file? That's up to you. A lot of it depends on how good of a file you made to start with. If I take a 10 megapixel file and I print a 40-inch print, I can make it look good, especially if I put it on canvas, right? Because now I have texture. Texture hides a multitude of sins. I probably wouldn't print the 10 megapixel file on a 40 or 50 inch image on glossy paper because you're going to see too much. It's going to look a little pasty. On canvas, it's going to look a little painterly. Okay, so you're actually thinking about your print all the way to the medium you're using. If I have an image like this one, I might say, well, I got tons of resolution, and this is going to look great in a glossy print. Although I do love canvas. But I might say, let's do a metal, let's do a glossy. Most of what I do personally is on heirloom canvas, not inkjet canvas, but mastering the print and then sending it to a canvas shop like canvasmount.com and bonding that to the print. Okay, now on some images, I'm dealing with stitching. Here's the render of this one that is one of my new pieces that was a pano, and I waited for years to get this scene down in Utah, and I'll probably be printing this at 130, 140 inches, and we have tons of res to work with. This one was done on a 5D Mark II, but it was stitched, so I have a cropped resolution of 26,000 pixels wide. And so I'll probably still have to upconvert this to print it at 130 inches. But the point being, I have an enormous amount of detail in this, and I did a stitch. Rather than just do a single image, I knew when I saw this scene, the light was good, the clouds were there, which is rare for this spot, overlooking Zion. I'm like, okay, let's stitch it. Let's do a panorama and really make sure we get the resolution because I'm going to want to print this large. Panoramas don't come across that well if they're only 30 inches. I mean, they're nice, but they're so suited to be really wide and big. And you can see that my Lightroom, even on my 12-core processor, is struggling with this because it takes a while to load. It's a huge file, and this is actually an edited, layered version as well. This is the finished image. Okay, so think it through. It starts in camera, but it goes right up to the end of planning. Okay, here's my final image for this particular print. I'm going to resize it to 200, 220, 300 DPI if need be. Then I'm going to sharpen it accordingly. And when I'm doing that sharpening on the very final print, because sharpening can vary depending on the size of the print, I'm not going to sharpen the daylights out of it. I don't want to make it seem over the top. I'm going to bring it into Photoshop at that real life ratio using the ruler, and I'm going to say, okay, how sharp do I want it to look in the print? Of course, the print's always going to look different from the screen, but the point is, I can come in here, and I can think it through, I can visualize it on the screen, and then usually, if I'm printing my own, I'll make like a 24-inch test print to review it then again in the real world, because it's not the same on the screen as versus a print. I'll often see things I didn't see otherwise. This is one reason why it's great to print your own. However, even if you're using a lab, all these processes you can still follow through. All the finished images you're seeing today, I've processed them in Lightroom, then I've taken them into Photoshop to do the very final elements, the burning, the dodging, the details. And then when I go to print, I'll do the extra final elements like sharpening and noise and things like that for the print that I'm making that's appropriate to the medium I'm using, be it glossy, be it canvas. And so you might want to vary your sharpening based on that. Long story short, more resolution is better, if you want to make large prints. And so I just always shoot at maximum resolution. People say, well, that uses a lot of disk space. Well, disk space is pretty cheap. And so I'm going to set up and get the maximum file I can, so when I get the image that's amazing, that I want to print large like this one, I don't have a problem going 60, 70 inches. The quality is going to be there, and I'm not kicking myself for saying, why did I shoot this in JPEG, or why did I shoot this in small RAW when I could have had all that information? So I'm always thinking about quality from start to finish. When you're going to make a print, think about the resolution you have available, compare that to how much you can upconvert and gain a little bit, but not the same as having native resolution, and compare that to how large you want it, and then decide how much sharpening you need, what medium you want to print it on, etc. Plan your process. The printing and presentation is a key part of the photographic process that is often lost in digital, and when you actually start printing and hanging pieces on the wall, you learn so much about maintaining that quality in your files from start to finish. This one went a little long, but for those of you that are making prints, and I'm sure all of you are making prints sometimes, regardless of the size, make your prints absolutely shine, because that's what separates the men from the boys when it comes to putting art on the walls. And when you start thinking from start to finish in that way, it's going to make you a better image maker. All right, I hope this helped. Let me know if you have any questions. Enjoy.